Have you ever wondered how many stories sleep beneath your feet, while Europe continues rushing to the surface? There is an ancient silence beneath the cities, an echo of footsteps that we no longer hear, corridors that breathe memory. If you feel like certain things are coincidence, maybe this video is what you needed to hear, because during decades, patient excavations and precise instruments began to reveal that the ground Europe is not just soil and rock, it is a living archive. Under churches, villages, and cultivated fields, there are ancient labyrinths, tunnels excavated with human hands, sealed chambers, passages that seem to have no end. Some were found by chance, others by scientific insistence. Each discovery brought the same unsettling feeling. Someone has been here before for much longer than we imagined, and it left deep marks in the darkness. Science usually advances cautiously. Measure, date, compare. And yet when descends underground, she finds something that escapes the numbers. It's not just engineering old, it's intention, it's choice. It is the conscious decision to go down, to disappear from the light, of building in silence. Why? What leads a civilization to invest entire generations, digging the earth as if writing a message for the future? For a long time, these spaces were treated as isolated curiosities. One cave here, a tunnel there, a forgotten underground city. But, as the years passed years, a pattern began to emerge. From Anatolia to the heart of Europe, structures similar ones emerge, repeating forms, solutions, and perhaps purposes. How if share the same invisible language? There is something deeply human about descending. Psychologists talk about the unconscious. Mystics, they speak from the womb of the earth. Ancient myths speak of initiation, death, and rebirth. Going down is face the dark to find meaning. And maybe that's why these labyrinths they play so much. They are not just physical works. They are mirrors of the mind and soul. In this video, we will not romanticize or discredit. Let's hear what science revealed after decades of excavations, maps, and measurements. But let's also listen to what remains between the lines, what the graphics do not explain. Porque algumas verdades they do not announce themselves out loud. They whisper. As we walk through these ancient corridors, we are invited to slow down, remembering that the story doesn't just happen on the surface. It accumulates in layers, like sediments from human experience. And sometimes, to understand who we are now, we need to accept what hardest invitation of all, to go down, in silence, and look at what was forgotten. Perhaps the real mystery is not what was built, but what still calls to us. Something in us recognizes these paths, as if the soul remembers an old passage. Stay with me until the end, because each layer revealed brings a question closer, greater. What happens when we face that which has always been below, hoping that someone had the courage to go down again without fear, with respect, and with curiosity silent of those who know that not every labyrinth exists? There is something underground that crosses cultures, eras, and continents. Since the being human started telling stories, he talks about tunnels, caves, hidden passages, places where the world above cannot reach. It's not just geological curiosity. It's a called ancient. Coming down has always meant more than hiding. It meant to seek answers, where the light does not reach. Archaeologists know this. Whenever an excavation breaks through the first layer of earth, something changes. The sound becomes muffled, the air becomes denser, the perception of time changes. Many researchers report the same feeling, a mixture of respect and uneasiness, as if that space had not been made for quick visits, but for permanence, weight, transformation. For decades, science treated these underground structures as practical solutions: invasion shelters, natural warehouses, expanded mines, functional explanations. They help, but they don't explain everything, because in many cases, the effort used to dig it was disproportionate to the immediate need. Too long tunnels, deep chambers too much, systems too complex for simple emergencies. When you look at the European map, you notice something intriguing. People who never had direct contact with each other chose the same essential gesture: going down. Celts, Romans, Germanic peoples, medieval communities. They all left marks under the ground. How if there was an intuitive understanding that the underground offered something that the surface eye couldn't give it? Anthropologists suggest that the underground represents primitive security, return to the womb, a space of protection against external chaos. Jungian psychologists see another layer, the symbol of the collective unconscious. Going down would mean confronting what was repressed, forgotten, denied. Talvez essas estruturas não sejam apenas respostas a external threats, but attempts to organize the inner world. Modern science began to take this more seriously when it noticed patterns applicants, narrow entrances that force the body to bend over, corridors that confuse the guidance, large rooms after long claustrophobic stretches. The architecture of underground seems to dialogue with the human mind, conducting emotions, provoking fear, relief, silence. None of this seems accidental. Vários sítios escavados. Pesquisadores notaram ausência de sinais típicos de habitação common. Little soot, few domestic remains. In some cases, no sign of continuous use. This raises an uncomfortable question. What if these spaces weren't for life, but to go through something? A rite, a preparation, a conscious wait for difficult times or for something bigger. If something inside you is awakening while listening to this, stay until the end. My answer may be here, because the call of the underground doesn't just belong to the past. It continues to resonate with us. Just notice how fascinated we are by bunkers, caves, hidden cities. Films, books, and dreams always return to the same scenario. Go down to survive. Go down to understand. Geologists say digging deep requires long-term planning. It's not an impulse. It is collective decision. This means that entire communities have agreed to invest energy, time, and risk in something they might not see completed. A gesture like this carries belief, confidence that space would be needed, even if not immediately. There are historical records of people who disappeared from the surface for generations, living below, returning only when the danger ceased. Others never returned. They left empty corridors, like stone lungs waiting for breath. Science measures dates, but it doesn't measure intentions. And perhaps that is where the biggest mystery lies. The underground is not just the absence of light. It is an environment that demands inner silence. Every step echoes. Every decision matters. Maybe that's why these labyrinths bewilder. They remind us that there was a time when going down was so natural how much to advance. A time when the future was prepared in darkness. And the question begins to take shape, slowly and inevitably. If so many people responded to this call, if so many labyrinths were excavated with such dedication, what exactly were they hoping to find, or avoid, down there? In 1963, in the Cappadocia region of Turkey, a man knocked down a wall in his house to do a simple renovation. On the other side there was no solid rock. There was a narrow corridor that descended into darkness. Without knowing it, he had touched the edge of one of the largest underground structures ever discovered by modern science. Derinkuyu, a labyrinth excavated almost 80 meters deep with dozens of levels, capable of housing thousands of people for long periods. When archaeologists began mapping the site, they noticed something disconcerting. Derinkuyu was not a makeshift cave. It was a complete city. There were stables, grain stores, kitchens, wine presses, schools, churches, water wells, and a ventilation system so efficient that it still works today. Tudo isso enterrado sob a terra, invisible for centuries. The immediate question was not how, but why. The initial explanation seemed simple. Refuge. Cappadocia was the scene of constant invasions throughout history. Going down would mean surviving. But that answer started to fail as details emerged. Inlets were designed to be easily sealed through circular stone doors, weighing hundreds of pounds. Narrow corridors required invaders advancing in single file. There was a strategy, yes, but there was also something beyond urgency. The Derinkuyu scale suggests long-term planning. Dig millions of meters cubes of volcanic rock is not the task of a terrified generation. It is the work of centuries. This means that someone decided to invest. Underground, even when the surface was still, it was habitable, not as a last resort, but as a conscious choice. The city was not made for a few days. It was made to stay. And Derinkuyu is not alone. Cappadocia is home to dozens of underground cities similar. some connected by tunnels that stretch for kilometers. Kaymakli, Özkonak, Maza, each with variations, but obeying the same principle architectural, as if they shared transmitted knowledge, a tradition underground passed down from generation to generation. Geologists explain that the volcanic tuff in the region facilitates excavation, but not easy explains complexity. Vertical ventilation systems cross multiple levels, ensuring oxygen even with thousands of people below. The water came from wells internal, protected against external contamination. There are no signs of excessive smoke, indicating precise fire control. Everything points to silent, efficient engineering, almost humble. The most intriguing is intermittent use. Evidence for archaeological findings indicate that these cities were not inhabited all the time. They were activated, as if they were waiting for a signal. Entire populations descended, stayed for weeks, months, perhaps years, and then returned to the surface. This pattern raises an uncomfortable question. What kind of threat required disappearing without a trace? Some researchers suggest religious persecution. Others talk about wars. There are those who mention climatic instabilities. But none of these hypotheses alone explains the repetition of the phenomenon at different times. Nor does it explain the almost ritual care certain spaces. Underground churches were decorated. Some rooms appear to have been made for gatherings, not shelter. There was silence there. Intention. Pause. For environmental psychology, underground spaces alter human behavior. Time seems suspended. The body slows down. The mind enters a state of vigilance and introspection. Maybe living below wasn't just about surviving, but also about preserving something immaterial. Traditions, memories, identity. As if, when descending, people protected not just their bodies, but their essence. Derinkuyu forces science to recognize its limits. We know when part of it was expanded. We know how it was excavated, but we don't know what was going on in his mind of those who decided to dig so deep. We do not know what they feared, nor what expected. We only know that they trusted the earth as their guardian. Today, tourists walk these corridors with electric lights, maps, and guides. But something remains intact. A thick silence. A feeling that this place was not made to be fully understood. As if the underground city was a response to a question that we have not yet learned to ask. And as more cities like this are revealed, the idea that Derinkuyu is exception falls apart. She is part of something bigger, an ancestral pattern, a reminder that, when the world above became too uncertain, our ancestors did not flee too far. They went down, and they let the earth keep its secrets, hoping that one day alguém tivesse coragem de perguntar por que tantos caminhos levam para baixo. When the gaze of science moves away from Cappadocia and covers the European map, something disturbing begins to emerge. Derinkuyu stops seeming like an isolated case and becomes just the most visible piece of a much larger puzzle. Under gentle hills, cities, ancient cities, and silent fields, Europe hides a second landscape. A geography parallel made of tunnels, chambers, and labyrinths that cross centuries. In France, hundreds of kilometers of galleries stretch beneath Paris. The catacombs, today famous, they began as Roman quarries, but over time they were expanded, connected, and reorganized, not just to extract stone, but to create a functional world below the surface. During wars, revolutions, and epidemics, they went down, and, upon descending, they modified these spaces, adapting them to something more than work. In England, an older mystery has intrigued archaeologists for decades. The known tunnels such as Phocaeus and Dina holes, excavated deep underground, many of them date back to the Iron Age. These are no ordinary mines. They have circular chambers, vertical access narrow, and almost no signs of everyday use. Some suggest storage, others, refuge. But the effort used contradicts simple explanations. There is something deliberately hidden in these spaces. In Italy, under Naples, there is an Adorium, entire underground city. Greeks, Romans, medieval monks, and populations excavated and reused tunnels for more than 2,000 years. Aqueducts became shelters. Quarries became churches. During World War II, thousands of people survived below while bombs fell above. But what draws attention is not just reuse but continuity. Each generation descended knowing that someone had been there before. In the heart of Central Europe, Especially in Germany and Austria, there are medieval tunnels, known as Erdstelle. These are extremely narrow passages, often forcing adults to crawl. They don't lead anywhere apparent. They don't make it easy transport, commerce, or defense. And yet, there are thousands of them. Dated between 10th and 13th centuries, its purpose remains officially unknown. What most intrigues researchers is the structural similarity between tunnels separated by great distances, discrete inputs, winding passages, small rooms that seem made for pause, not for permanence. This suggests a shared logic, one tradition that did not depend on writing, but on practice transmitted orally. As the underground knowledge passed on in silence, science tries to classify mines, refugees, escape routes, but each category fails some point. Many of these structures do not have typical mining residues. Outras são pequenas demais para abrigar populações inteiras. Some are far from any strange route-known technique. And then the less comfortable hypothesis arises. Maybe not everything was made to be functional to our modern eyes. Cultural anthropologists note that in several ancient European societies, the underground was associated with the sacred. It was the place of the dead, of ancestors, of invisible gods. Coming down was not just about escaping, but about getting in touch. In Celtic myths, for example, the another world is often accessed through hollow hills or caves. In traditions Germanic, beings live below the earth, storing knowledge and wealth. These narratives do not appear out of nowhere. They feed on the environment. From experiences reais como espaços que alteram a percepção. In narrow tunnels, the body loses reference of time. Breathing becomes conscious. Each sound is amplified. It's not hard to imagine that these places have been used for rites of passage, initiations, or moments of collective decision-making. Experimental archaeology has shown that digging in these contexts required intense cooperation. No one digs a maze alone. This implies social consensus, planning, one reason strong enough to justify the risk, because the underground does not forgive mistakes. One slip, a ventilation failure, and it's all over. Still, they dug. Perhaps the biggest mistake is looking for a single answer. Underground Europe may have served multiple purposes over time. Shelter in a century, ritual in another, spiritual refuge when the world above became too unstable. What remains constant is the gesture, descending as a response to chaos. Each tunnel discovered expands the question. If so many cultures in so many places decided investing energy in invisible worlds, what does this say about the human experience? Maybe there is ancient wisdom there, the understanding that not everything is resolved on the surface, that sometimes to get through dark periods you literally have to go inside the land. And the more science maps these labyrinths, the clearer it becomes that we are just starting to see this parallel Europe, a silent Europe, buried, waiting patiently for someone to not only discover it but try to understand why so many paths, in so many times, led exactly downwards. For a long time, the underground was a limit. Science saw the earth as a barrier opaque, difficult to cross without destroying what one sought to understand. Dig it meant intervening, changing, running the risk of losing information forever. But in recent decades, something has changed. Technology itself has begun to learn to see in the dark, without touching, without breaking. And it was at that moment that the ancestral labyrinths began to reappear. One of the biggest revolutions came from the use of ground-penetrating radar. Electromagnetic waves are sent to the earth and return with subtle echoes, revealing voids, discontinuities, hidden structures. What once required years of excavation can now be mapped out in weeks, and the results have been, to say the least, disturbing. Under areas considered fully known, anomalies arise, empty spaces where nothing should exist. In several regions of Central Europe, radar surveys have revealed networks of tunnels much larger than imagined. Some do not appear in historical records. Others pass under modern buildings, untouched. Science, used to confirming hypotheses, began to be surprised by new questions. Why are these spaces not, were they documented? Why didn't they collapse? And most importantly, why doesn't anyone talk of them? Another silent tool is LiDAR, ATOI, technology that uses laser pulses to map surfaces with extreme precision. Although best known for revealing lost cities under forests, as occurred in the Americas, LiDAR has also been used to detect irregularities in the European relief. Small depressions, subtle alignments, hollow hills, evidence that what we see above is just a shell. In some cases, confirmation came later, where LiDAR suggested void, excavations, careful found chambers, collapsed tunnels, sealed passages intentionally. Sealed, not destroyed. This is important. Sealing is a conscious gesture. It's closing something that can be opened again. Science recognizes this difference but rarely interprets it. Carbon and sediment dating also brought surprises. In certain tunnels, layers indicate intermittent use over centuries. There are no signs of occupation continuous, but returns. Entries reopened, floors redone. Como si alguien soubesse exactly when to descend and when to return to the surface. This pattern doesn't fit well in simple narratives of desperate escape. Structural engineers began to study these spaces to understand how they resisted to time. Many old tunnels exhibit impressive stability, angles calculated, curves that distribute pressure, intelligent use of local rock. In some cases, the absence of artificial supports is not false, it's strategy. The earth itself supports the land. This requires deep empirical knowledge, accumulated over generations. A ciência também começou a olhar para o corpo humano nesses ambientes. Studies of environmental neuroscience shows that underground spaces affect perception, memory, and emotional state. The brain reacts to the absence of a horizon, to the reduction of stimuli visuals, to amplified silence. Some researchers suggest that these effects may have been known intuitively by the ancients, who used the underground as psychological tool. Despite all these advances, there is resistance. Many discoveries remain in technical reports, away from the public. Some mapped areas are not disclosed fully. Authorities cite safety, preservation, structural risk. Arguments legitimate, but which also create areas of silence. Science here treads carefully, excessive, as if afraid of what else he might find. And there are also accidental finds. Modern works that break the ground and reveal forgotten passages. Tunnels that appear under roads, buildings, subway lines. Once this happens, the official narrative adjusts. An isolated tunnel, a rare case. But the number of rare cases grows too large to be ignored. The most disturbing thing is that the more technology develops, the more evident the incompleteness of the map. Underground Europe is fragmented but vast, connected but silent. Modern science can measure volumes, ages, and resistances, but no can measure intent. Can't answer why so many resources were invested in something that should remain invisible. Perhaps that is why these studies cause discomfort. They suggest that our ancestors had a different relationship with time than we do. They planned beyond of their own lives. They were building for crises that might never come, or that already they had arrived earlier, in memories that did not survive on the surface. Science has revealed a lot, but it has also exposed a clear limit. Every radar that crosses the Solo confirms that there is more emptiness than we thought, more spaces waiting interpretation. And as these invisible maps become visible, a question begins to take its toll. If we can now see what is below, we are truly prepared to accept what this says about our history, or would we prefer to continue looking only at the surface, pretending the rest is silence? After maps, dates, measurements, and hypotheses, the question remains suspended in the air like dust in an ancient tunnel. What were these underground labyrinths for, after all? A science has brought together possibilities, but no isolated answer is enough. The more observe, the clearer it becomes that we are facing something multifaceted, something that doesn't fit in a single function. The most comfortable explanation is that of shelter, escape from invasions, wars, persecution, religious. In many cases, this is true. There are clear historical records of populations who came down to survive. But the problem arises when we realize that not everyone the tunnels were in intense conflict zones. Some were excavated in regions relatively stable. Others are too narrow to accommodate large groups per long periods. Shelter explains part, but not the whole. Outra hipótese recorrente é o armazenamento. Constant temperature, protection against looters, food preservation. Again, it makes sense in certain contexts. However, Many of these spaces show no traces of continuous use. Waste missing organic materials, tools, signs of intense circulation. In several tunnels, the effort to dig was enormous, while the practical benefit seems minimal. Something doesn't close. It is at this point that archaeologists begin to use a word cautiously. Ritual. Spaces built not to live in but to cross. Not to stay, but to experience. Ancient societies rarely separated the practical from the symbolic. A place could be shelter and, at the same time, sacred. Going down could mean surviving but also dying symbolically to be reborn. Comparative anthropology studies show that initiation rites often they involve isolation, darkness, and physical discomfort. The individual leaves the community, enters in a liminal space and returns transformed. Narrow tunnels, low passages, absence of light. All this appears again and again in European labyrinths. Not by chance, but as default. Neuroscience helps understand why. Underground environments reduce stimuli sensorial, alter the perception of time, and intensify introspection. The brain goes into silent, alert state. Emotions emerge more strongly. For ancient people, without scientific language, this could be interpreted as contact with the divine, with ancestors, with something greater than the individual. There is also the climate hypothesis. Some researchers suggest that certain systems underground may have been used during periods of environmental instability. Winter, the severe conditions, prolonged droughts, extreme events. Going down would be a way to cross the difficult time, not just a few days, but entire seasons. Isso explicaria o planejamento long-term use and intermittent use over centuries. But there is still a deeper layer. Historical psychologists point out that societies who build underground worlds reveal a particular relationship with the future. They don't fully trust the stability of the surface. Prepare for collapse, even when everything seems calm. It's a mindset of anticipation, not reaction. One wisdom that is born from the memory of past crises. European myths reinforce this idea. Stories of people who hide underground until the danger passes. Of invisible realms that emerge only at specific times. These narratives can be symbolic echoes of real practices. Memories transmitted orally, distorted by time, but anchored in concrete experiences. There are also those who suggest multiple and alternating uses. A tunnel may have started as refuge, then became a ritual space, later a warehouse, and finally sealed. A modern archaeology tends to look for an original function, but perhaps this is a projection of our need for order. Ancient communities were more fluid in their uses. The same. Space could take on new meanings depending on the generations past. What stands out is the care taken with the closure. Many tunnels were not abandoned at random. They were deliberately sealed. Hidden entrances, passages blocked, as if someone wanted to ensure that it was only accessed in specific circumstances, not destroyed, preserved, saved. This attitude suggests respect. You don't seal something insignificant. Seal what has power, danger, or value. Science can measure the physical effort involved, but not the symbolic weight. And perhaps that is exactly where the difficulty lies in answering what they were for. We are trying to translate ancestral choices with very modern categories. Perhaps these labyrinths were, above all, complex responses to an unstable world. Answers that combine survival, spirituality, memory, and preparation. Spaces where humans could retreat when the surface became too noisy, too violent, too unpredictable. And this leads us to an inevitable question. If our ancestors invested so much in places of retreat, of silence and depth, what does this say about the way they see the world? And even more disturbing, what does it say about us? That we almost didn't build more places to descend, reflect, and wait, perhaps too trusting that the surface will you always sustain us. When science reaches the limit of what it can prove, cultural memory begins to speak, not as direct evidence, but as an echo. Across Europe, ancient myths point to the same place, below. Hidden kingdoms, invisible people, living gods under hills. Stories that, for a long time, were treated as fantasy, but that gained new weight when compared to the real structures buried beneath our feet. In Celtic tradition, the other world was not in the sky. It was under the ground. Hollow hills, called seed, they were portals, not ordinary caves. but entrances to a domain where time behaved differently. Heroes entered and returned, transformed, when they returned. Narrative is emerged in regions where tunnels and chambers subterraneans really exist. The coincidence is hard to ignore. Entre os povos germânicos e nórdicos, a terra também escondia mais do que raízes. Dwarves, elves, and guardians lived below, masters of the forge, knowledge, and ancient secrets. They weren't monsters. They were injunctions, inhabitants of the between worlds. Interestingly, many of the regions associated with these legends have networks of narrow tunnels, such as the Erdstelle, whose function remains unknown to this day. In ancient Greece, the underworld was not just the place of the dead. It was a space of passage. Oracles spoke of ritual descents. Heroes like Orpheus and Hercules passed through underground portals to seek wisdom, redemption, or truths that were not existed on the surface. The underground was dangerous, yes, but it was also necessary. Don't I reached understanding without coming down first? Christianity inherited part of this symbology. Catacombs became places of refuge but also of worship. Monks sought caves for spiritual isolation. Descend, it meant moving away from the noise of the world to listen to something more subtle. Hell, oddly enough, was also located below, not just as a physical space, but as a metaphor for inner descent, the confrontation with the shadow. Psychologists such as Carl Jung suggested that these images persist because they represent archetypes, the descent into the unconscious, the return to the symbolic womb, death and the psychological rebirth. But Jung also warned, archetypes do not appear out of nowhere. They feed on real human experiences, repeated over and over again, over generations, and that the experience of descending to earth, of living in it, of hiding in it, was real for many people. When comparing tunnel maps with myth maps, overlaps appear. Regions with a greater density of underground structures tend to have more rich stories about hidden worlds. This does not prove causality, but it suggests dialogue. The imagination collective molds itself to the environment. What is experienced becomes history. What repeats itself becomes a symbol. There is also the theme of waiting. Many myths speak of people who remain below until the tempo certo, sleeping, observing, getting ready. This idea appears in legends, medieval stories about kings sleeping beneath mountains, ready to return when the world need. It is not difficult to see this as a reflection of the underground cities used, intermittently, activated only at critical moments. These narratives carry strange wisdom for the modern world. They suggest that disappearing is not failure, that retreating can be a strategy, that there is value in to withdraw, to preserve strength, to wait. In a culture obsessed with constant advancement, these stories sound almost subversive. Science tends to separate myth and reality, but perhaps in this case, they go together. The underground labyrinths provide the body. Myths provide the soul. One explains how. The other tries to explain why. Together, they point to an ancient relationship between humanity and land, marked by respect, fear, and trust. Perhaps our ancestors knew something that we have unlearned, that the surface is unstable, what civilizations rise and fall, that true refuge is not always visible, and that, at certain moments in history, survival requires not conquering new territories, but remember ancient paths that lead inward, downward, to the silence where the ancestral memory continues to wait to be heard. Even with all the advances, there is a point where science needs to stop and admit uncertainty. European underground labyrinths present data but refuse final conclusions. Dates don't match, roles overlap, and evidence contradicts modern expectations. In many places, engineering seems too advanced to accepted explanations, while in others, extreme simplicity defies utilitarian logic. Researchers recognize patterns, but cannot explain common origin. There are unexplained documentary gaps, prolonged historical silences, and structures without clear cultural context. Science describes what it sees, measures what it finds, but stumbles when trying to respond to intention, motivation, and deep meaning. Some findings just don't add up. Tunnels too narrow for transport, too deep for storage, too complex for occasional use. In certain locations, entrances were sealed with no signs of collapse, as if access was deliberately interrupted. In others, There is no trace of haste or chaotic abandon. The absence of written records is also intriguing. People who documented taxes, harvests, and wars ignored gigantic projects under their own territories. It's not just lack of information, it is a systematic absence, difficult to attribute to historical chance. This void challenges traditional methodologies and causes persistent academic discomfort, profound even today among current European experts. Another limit appears when science tries to explain cultural continuity. Structures similar ones appear at different times attributed to different peoples, without evidence clear direct transmission. This suggests shared or rediscovered knowledge repeatedly. Both options defy linear models of progress. Furthermore, some tunnels show signs of careful maintenance over centuries, even when the surface changed drastically. Wars, empires, and religions passed, while passages remained functional. This silent persistence does not match with narratives of total collapse often used to explain the European past according to contemporary dominant historical analyses, taught in universities and traditional academic textbooks current today. There is also the problem of single explanations. Modern science prefers clear causes, but the European underground suggests overlapping uses. When reports attempt to reduce all under shelter or ritual, inconvenient data is minimized. Isso não implica má fé, mas reveals institutional limits. Research depends on funding, authorization, and consensus. Discoveries that challenge established narratives advance slowly. In some cases, studies stop at mapping, avoiding deep interpretations. Thus, the unknown remains catalogued but not faced, awaiting new approaches, interdisciplinary structures capable of integrating science, history, psychology, and cultural symbolism without hasty reductionisms or premature definitive conclusions in academic debate, current European today. Perhaps the biggest limit is emotional. Science is done by humans, and humans react to discomfort. Admitting that significant parts of the story remain unexplained threatens the feeling of control. Labyrinths challenge the idea of linear, predictable progress. They suggest cycles, retractions, waiting. Accepting this requires collective humility, requires recognition that knowledge can be lost, not just accumulated. For many, this idea is more disturbing than any dark tunnel. She questions the narrative of advancement constant that sustains modern identities and educational models transmitted globally for recent decades in official and popular European history curricula classica. Thus, what science cannot explain becomes as important as what it explains. These gaps point to new questions, not failure. They invite a slower listening, less anxious for final answers. Maybe labyrinths don't exist for be deciphered completely, but to remember human limits. They remain as silent witnesses of ancient choices made under extreme conditions. While instruments improve, the mystery persists. And perhaps this persistence is, in itself, the most honest message left under Europe awaiting future interpretations. Careful and truly integrating science, memory, and collective consciousness humanity on the European continent. Perhaps the greatest legacy of these labyrinths is not what they hide, but what awaken. They remind us that human history was not just written in squares, open spaces, and illuminated palaces, but also in the silence of the earth, where difficult decisions were taken out of sight. In times when survival required more than strength, it required reflection and deep patience. Beneath modern Europe, hurried and noisy, there remain corridors that do not ask quick responses. They ask to be listened to. Each tunnel is a pause in time, an invitation to remember that progress was not always forward. Sometimes it went downhill, inside, to a space where fear could be faced without spectacle and hope preserved far from the chaos of the surface. Science has revealed structures, dates, volumes, and techniques, but something remains untouched. One silent intention, an ancient agreement between humans and the earth. When everything seemed too unstable, our ancestors trusted the ground as shelter and witness. They knew who would find these places in the future. Still, they built it, like who plants a seed for times that do not yet exist. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul may be remembering the path, because maybe these labyrinths aren't just ruins, maybe be mirrors, reflections of a forgotten wisdom that still pulses, waiting to be recognized amid the noise of the present. And now the final question is neither archaeological nor scientific. It's intimate. In a world each increasingly exposed, accelerated, and unstable, where would you go if you needed to preserve the essential? Where would you go if you needed to protect what really matters? And if what we call the past is not buried, but just waiting in silence for someone to remember how to get down again?